I've read every book by Nietzsche, most of them multiple times, and in this video I'm going to rank them in a tier list. I'll go over each major book starting with The Birth of Tragedy. Some of the smaller essays I'll skip, but if this video does well, I can do a part 2 and discuss these shorter essays. For this video, I want to focus on the big books. Please note, this list is based on my personal preference and enjoyment of the works. Therefore, it's not a good list to know where to start with Nietzsche. We've done a dedicated video on that question, linked in the description. Also in the description, you'll find a list of all the big long-form analysis videos we've done here on the channel. We've actually covered most of Nietzsche's big works in fairly deep depth, and the books we haven't covered yet we'll cover in the future. So subscribe if you don't want to miss these. With all of that said, let's start with Nietzsche's first big breakthrough work, The Birth of Tragedy. By the way, if you care about your online privacy, and why shouldn't you, you'll benefit from using Surfshark, the sponsor of today's video. Surfshark is a VPN that keeps you safe and private by covering up everything you do online. Websites that try to snoop on you or steal your information won't be able to do so. They operate 3,200 servers in 100 countries to mask your own data so companies can't steal it from you. But there are other benefits as well. You can connect to servers in different countries, which makes websites think you're accessing them from those countries. That means that, for example, you can access the Netflix library of other regions. Or you can save money on websites that price their products depending on your physical location. A VPN also keeps you safe on public Wi-Fi when you're accessing unknown networks. And a cool little feature that Surfshark offers is the option to block those annoying cookie consent pop-ups that every website has nowadays. They offer a 30-day money-back guarantee as well, giving you ample time to test out all of these features. Get Surfshark VPN at surfshark.deals/Veldgeist and enter the promo code Veldgeist for an exclusive offer and 3 extra months for free. The link is also in the description. Thank you to Surfshark for sponsoring this video. Now, back to the tier list. So, The Birth of Tragedy. This book was Nietzsche's love letter to Richard Wagner. Part 1 discusses ancient Greek culture, how they developed tragedy and what that means for their worldview and what happened to it during the Socratic Revolution. And the second part discusses the revival of Greek-like culture through the revitalizing art of Richard Wagner. The work is mostly known for introducing the twin concepts of the Apollonian and the Dionysian, representing two aspects of art, with the Apollonian being the principle of delineation, limits, rationality, individuation, exemplified in the arts of sculpture and painting. The Dionysian, on the other hand, is the art of formlessness, ecstasy, exuberance, irrationality, exemplified by music. These two principles find their synthesis in ancient Greek tragedy. Over time, however, under the influence of Socrates and the playwright Euripides, the Apollonian side of the coin got the upper hand, as Greek culture lost touch with its Dionysian origins. The result was disastrous and spelled the end of the Greek Golden Age, and its consequences, according to Nietzsche, are still felt to this day. In comes Richard Wagner, whose Ring der Nibelungen Gesamtkunstwerk would revive the ancient Greek ideal and restore the Dionysian balance. Of course, Nietzsche would come to regret his association with Wagner, and he would disavow Schopenhauer's philosophy, which he fully embraced and expanded upon even in this work. The Birth of Tragedy thus occupies a strange place in the Nietzschean canon. He came to disagree with many of his own ideas, while he still tried to save the work by republishing it years later with a new foreword and subtitle, which focused more on the specific brand of pessimism espoused by the ancient Greeks, which was a different type of pessimism than the one in vogue in Germany at the time, which we call Weltschmerz nowadays. Nietzsche dubbed this Greek kind of pessimism Dionysian pessimism, and the word Dionysian would remain a central concept in his philosophy, even as its meaning changed quite a bit. So, The Birth of Tragedy remains an important work, especially the first part, but the reader needs to keep in mind that many elements, most notably its embrace of Schopenhauer, were later disavowed by Nietzsche. Still, the work offers a great insight into the mind of one of philosophy's most ingenious minds, and in its discussions on Greek culture, Nietzsche, the philologist, really showed off his brilliance. I'm putting it in the B tier. Next, we have the Untimely Meditations, a series of 4 essays. Nietzsche's original plan was to publish 13 essays, but he seems to have lost interest after publication of the first three. The fourth one, called Richard Wagner in Bayreuth, was published 2 years after the first three and only at the behest of one of Nietzsche's best friends. The first essay deals with David Strauss, a German Protestant theologian who became famous for denying the divine nature of Christ, yet still espousing a new kind of Christian faith based on the scientific method as applied to history. Strauss is a key figure in the so-called quest for the historical Jesus, a movement in theology that sought to portray Jesus as a historical figure, separating fact from legend. Nietzsche then uses Strauss as a sort of stand-in for German culture at the time at large, and he levels some critiques of it. Honestly, I think this essay can be skipped by most people, unless you happen to be really interested in the German culture of the late 18th century, or if you're really deep into Nietzsche's thought anyway. The second essay, on the use and abuse of history for life, is more interesting. Here we find Nietzsche's thoughts on history and his particular brand of anthropology, his view on humanity. His elitism, which would become more apparent in later works, shines through for the first time here. Most notably, he talks about how history is driven by a select few great individuals, and how the great mass of men don't really amount to much, except for preparing the world for the arrival of epoch-making individuals. All of these ideas, however, are more fleshed out in later works. The third essay then, Schopenhauer as Educator, is my favorite. It's basically Nietzsche's love letter to Schopenhauer. He considered himself a disciple of his until, of course, he completely broke with him later in life and changed his philosophical outlook completely and utterly, and changed it in opposition to his former mentor. Still, the essay is well worth reading for anyone interested in both Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. Finally, there is the aforementioned Richard Wagner in Bayreuth. Nietzsche himself was unsure of this essay, as it was written and published in a time where he began to rethink his association with Wagner. His friend convinced him to release it anyway, edited to be less polemical and harsh. Nietzsche would later write a book called The Case of Wagner, which is the better work about the composer. All in all, I'd put the Untimely Meditations in the D tier. They can be safely skipped. The Schopenhauer essay, however, is really good. Nietzsche's first book in his trademark aphoristic style is Human All Too Human. This makes the book a tougher read than the other books we discussed so far. Difficulties compound because this book is still considered early to middle Nietzsche, and many ideas expressed in here will evolve or even radically change later in his development. For example, Nietzsche had not yet thought of the Übermensch, but embryonic concepts like his archetype of the free thinker do play a significant role in the work. The book also features numerous critiques against Darwin, which would play an increasing important role in his later works, evolving finally into the famous Will to Power. As such, this book can be skipped, in the sense that all the important ideas here are talked about with much more distinction and clarity in later works. However, being written in the aphoristic poetic style, there are some poems here too. The book is a fun read. I'm putting it in the C tier. Daybreak. With this book, Nietzsche begins his attack on morality. That's what he himself said about this book. Here, Nietzsche really comes into his own. The book is tragically underrated. Understandably, because many of its ideas will be perfected in later works, most notably Beyond Good and Evil and the Genealogy of Morals. In many ways, this book can be considered a prequel. Still, it's well worth a read. The prose is actually much more accessible than in Beyond Good and Evil, and Nietzsche lays down a solid argument for his genealogical view of morality. Not yet conceiving of master and slave morality, he instead talks about morality of custom and tradition. If you've tried Beyond Good and Evil or the Genealogy of Morals and found them too difficult, then give this book a shot. I'm putting it in the B tier. If you're into Nietzsche at all, don't sleep on this book. For some reason, it's become a bit of a forgotten work, and our dedicated analysis video also didn't do as well as the others. A real shame, because this book is a gem. Still, Beyond Good and Evil and the Genealogy of Morals did it better. Hence, a placement in the B tier. Next is The Joyful Science. Two of Nietzsche's most famous ideas find their genesis here: the death of God and the eternal return. Nietzsche actually republished this book with a fifth part after the release of Thus Spoke Zarathustra and Beyond Good and Evil, so the chronology here gets a bit twisted. I consider this one of the more magical works by Nietzsche. It seems like there's an aphorism for everything, It's perhaps not best read in one sitting, but as an anthology, just finding relevant aphorisms for whatever you're looking for at the moment, or simply opening the book at random and reading whatever comes up. As the title might suggest, here Nietzsche really embraced his philosophy of joyfulness, levity, of dancing. The title refers to the medieval poetry of the troubadours in Europe, and this book features quite a lot of poetry. In this book, you truly feel something that becomes increasingly apparent as you learn more about Nietzsche's philosophy. That is, the more other books of Nietzsche you read, the more clear the meaning of this one becomes. Nietzsche is hard to get into. You need to read a lot and trust that over time you'll gain a higher perspective. His philosophy is like a tapestry where you can study the individual threads, but it's only when you zoom out that you can see the drawing of the entire thing and realize how each individual thread fits into the whole. Lots of people get stuck on Nietzsche. My advice is always the same. Read more and trust that in time you'll synthesize everything. The more you read, the more it makes sense. The Joyful Science is ideally read twice. Once when you're not as familiar with Nietzsche, and then again when you've explored more. I promise you it will be two different experiences. An A tier for The Joyful Science. Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the big one. Written in a cryptic style, parodying the Bible, it does not give up its secrets easily. Nietzsche writes in parables, symbols, and there is a plot to the story presented here, but it's easy to miss. Honestly, the only way you'll ever understand this book is when you've read other works by Nietzsche, and just reading them is not enough, but you need to actually understand them. Because of its fame, many people jump in and just start reading this work. I can promise you, without a solid background of Nietzsche's ideas, you simply won't understand this work. People will claim that they're the exception, and I think they're mistaken. I believe it's simply impossible, and the fact that Nietzsche wrote several books after this one, whose sole function it was to explain Zarathustra, is enough proof of this. A book about eagles, apples, tarantulas, lions, camels, babies, and tightrope walkers. Songs about intoxication, eternal return, the Übermensch, critiques against Christianity, Stoicism, and other philosophies without even mentioning them by name. Zarathustra is a mysterious book, but it is a masterpiece. Just save it for last. S tier. Immediately following Zarathustra, we have Beyond Good and Evil, which was explicitly written to basically explain what Zarathustra is about. Fun fact, the book only sold 200 copies during Nietzsche's lifetime. I consider Beyond Good and Evil to be one of the more difficult works, even though it's 100 times easier than Zarathustra. Still, without a solid background of the history of philosophy, you'll feel completely lost reading this work. Many of the ideas here will be expounded upon in later works, and the aphoristic style can be off-putting to some. This book is home to gems such as "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger." If you stare long enough into the abyss stares back. And everything that is done in the name of love is done beyond good and evil. Zarathustra is Nietzsche's most forward-looking work, and that is reflected here in Beyond Good and Evil. The whole book is in fact a sort of call to action for so-called free spirits, philosophers of the future, who will need to carry out the difficult task of creating a new morality after the old moralities of Christianity and several other philosophies are deemed insufficient. Nietzsche takes many philosophers to school, most notably Descartes, Kant, Schopenhauer, and the entire school of Stoicism. Hence why a solid background knowledge of philosophy in general is pretty much necessary to fully comprehend this work. We have to keep in mind that Nietzsche wrote for an educated audience. He assumes that his readers are familiar with all this stuff. Of course, I consider this book required reading for any Nietzsche enthusiast, but its main ideas, I believe, are expressed more clearly in subsequent works. So, A tier. The Genealogy of Morals is another book where Nietzsche expounds on ideas of the two previous works, although the scope of this work is more limited. Rare among Nietzsche's works, it actually sets out a grand philosophical thesis in a polemical, argumentative style. As the title tells you, it deals with the question of where our current morality comes from. It's a historical book, Nietzsche's speculative investigation into the source of our Western Christian morality. This is where Nietzsche fully embraces the idea of master and slave moralities and how they come to be in any given society. In many ways, it continues the line of thought first started in Daybreak. The book consists of 3 essays, and especially the last one is a masterpiece of philosophical writing. Centered around the question of what is the meaning of ascetic ideals, Nietzsche builds up tension and neglects to actually answer the question until the very end of the entire book. It's also probably the most accessible work of Nietzsche's, simply because it lacks his aphoristic style, and the entire book is about a single subject, a single line of thought that Nietzsche follows throughout without many tangents. If we disregard Zarathustra for a minute, because it's in a league of its own, I consider this work to be Nietzsche's masterpiece. S tier. Check out our 1 hour long video on the book as well. It's my personal favorite video on the channel. The Case of Wagner is a short work in which Nietzsche formally announces his break with Wagner. Whereas the second part of The Birth of Tragedy was basically a love letter to Wagner, this book cements Wagner as Nietzsche's antipode, his opposite. Nominally, the reason for the break is Wagner's developing artistic style. Nietzsche had praised Wagner's 4-part operatic cycle, The Ring of the Nibelung, in The Birth of Tragedy as a possible conduit for a revival of German culture in the style of the ancient Greek conception of art. Wagner was going to save art and European culture in general. However, in Nietzsche's view, he took a wrong turn and headed down the wrong path towards nihilism. Notably, Wagner discovered and embraced Schopenhauer halfway through completing the Ring cycle, and mature works such as Tristan und Isolde, and especially Parsifal, completely embraced Schopenhauerian and even Christian ethics. For Nietzsche, this was enough to completely disavow Wagner. The result is this work. He disparages Wagner and praises Bizet as the true saving grace of music with his opera Carmen. To what extent Nietzsche really meant this, or in which capacity he was being ironic, remains open to academic discussion. Still, we have to keep in mind that Nietzsche in his younger years had a very close friendship with Wagner. He knew the man personally. And as such, there are reasons to think that Nietzsche's break with Wagner was not based on actual philosophical disagreement, but that it was a case of a ruined friendship that Nietzsche tried to justify after the fact with flimsy philosophical reasoning. In private letters to friends, for example, he talked about the magnificence of the music of Parsifal, even as he publicly, in his published books, completely bashed the work. The Case of Wagner is an interesting read if you're into opera. Obviously, it's unwise to engage with this work if you're not familiar with Wagner's operas or even classical music in general. Wagner being the superstar artist of his time, Nietzsche assumes familiarity with his work. Personally, I have a soft spot for the work. It showcases some of Nietzsche's best prose in my opinion, not to mention immortal jabs at Wagner, such as the quote, "Is Wagner even a man? Is he not more like a disease? Everything he touches becomes sick." Still, I can't really justify a high placement for the work for the simple reason that it's not on quite the same philosophical level as some of his other works. Therefore, B tier. Twilight of the Idols is next. At the time of writing this, Nietzsche was actually enjoying some growing popularity. Because of this, he felt he needed a short text to summarize his main ideas. The title is a pun on Twilight of the Gods, the final opera in Wagner's Ring cycle. In the book, he takes several philosophical idols to task. Hence also the subtitle of the work, How to Philosophize with a Hammer. The symbol of the hammer not only represents the destruction of old philosophical ideas, Nietzsche explicitly mentions the imagery of a hammer hitting a bell and listening to the reverberating sound, finding these ideas ultimately hollow. Some people argue that the hammer symbolism can only be about this bell thing, but Nietzsche was a man who made it his life's mission to basically oppose all philosophy before him and who called himself dynamite. To suggest that the hammer has nothing to do with the notion of destruction, the most immediate association people have with hammers, is pretty silly to me. Anyway, I love this book. It's probably the book by Nietzsche I've read the most. Just like all of Nietzsche's works, it gives up its secrets only when you're also familiar with the rest of his work. So it's a very rewarding experience to read the book and reread it again at a later date. Twilight of the Idols is the book by Nietzsche that most explicitly concerns itself with the theme of the strong versus the weak, if we discount his non-canonical work, The Will to Power, that is. Standout chapters are his extended critique of Socrates and the little chapter entitled Morality as Anti-Nature. The book is also radical. Nietzsche himself recognized this, calling the book radical to a fault. The writing style, the broad, sweeping generalizations, and the strong use of language may be off-putting to some, lacking the nuance of the earlier Nietzsche. But it's precisely Nietzsche's provocative style that makes him such an engaging thinker, and it's most expertly showcased in this little book. S tier. Then, The Antichrist was meant to be part 1 in a 4-part series entitled The Transvaluation of Values. Unfortunately, however, Nietzsche never finished the other 3 parts on account of his insanity. As you might guess from the title, The Antichrist is Nietzsche's most sustained critique, an attack even on Christianity. Like Twilight of the Idols, it's very radical in tone. There's little in this book about Nietzsche's philosophy that isn't said in his other works, most notably the Genealogy of Morals, but when Nietzsche puts on his theologian's hat and critiques the Christian Bible, he has some original thoughts that are intriguing, but only if you have a good knowledge of the Bible and the New Testament in particular. Nietzsche's father was a Lutheran pastor, and Nietzsche was always fascinated and intrigued by Christianity. He also lived in a time where Christianity was simply a bigger part of people's lives. So for us, readers in the 21st century, the book asks a lot. He presents an interesting theological thesis about the true message of Jesus and its subsequent distortion by the apostles and Paul in particular. His theology is very speculative, however. Nice to think about, but dubiously substantiated by history or modern theology. Interestingly, the book was written in 1888, but only released 7 years later, because Nietzsche became insane, was hospitalized, and the manuscript fell into the hands of his friends and caretakers, who decided to delay its publication due to its radical content. I'm putting it in the B tier. It's a solid book, well worth reading, and especially so if you have an interest in Christianity. Speaking of late publications, Ecce Homo, Nietzsche's intellectual autobiography, was written in the same year as The Antichrist, but only released in 1908, a whopping 20 years after it was written, and 8 years after Nietzsche died, even. The book stands out for its provocative chapter headings, featuring such gems as Why I Am So Clever, Why I Am So Wise, and, of course, Why I Write Such Good Books. These chapter headings have unsurprisingly become subject of discussion. For some people, it's indicative of Nietzsche's forthcoming slip into insanity. For others, it's simply irony, a joke. In our dedicated analysis video of the work, we discussed the possibility that Nietzsche poked fun at Wagner's own self-congratulatory autobiography here, parodying his own megalomania. Nietzsche discusses the course of his own life, and basically psychoanalyzes himself and his place in the world, and also goes over each book he has written and shares his thoughts on their significance. The book only has little philosophical content, but it's an interesting look into the mind of Nietzsche and how he saw himself. The book features the prophecy that he wrote 200 years before his time, that his philosophy would not be understood in its full implications for another 2 centuries. Since Nietzsche died in 1900, that means we're about halfway through. He also correctly predicted his own influence. He wrote that some men are only born after they die. That turned out to be extremely true in his case. While he was moderately famous in his own lifetime, it was only after his slip into insanity and death that Nietzsche became the household name that he is today, and his influence is still felt in every branch of philosophy and art ever since. The book is well worth reading for any Nietzsche enthusiast. And before starting a main work from Nietzsche, it can be fruitful to read what he has to say about the particular book first in Ecce Homo. For example, he calls Daybreak the book in which he begins his assault on morality. Evidently, he himself thought that the book was more important than posterity has decided that it is. I'm putting this in the B tier as well. Finally, The Will to Power. To be clear, this isn't an official published work of Nietzsche. Rather, it's a collection of notes compiled by his sister and some friends after his death. As such, the book is controversial. Some people argue that it doesn't represent Nietzsche's ideas at all, while others say it's merely indicative of Nietzsche's ideas, and that it can be used, but with some caution. And others still maintain that the work is a true, honest reflection of the mature Nietzsche's philosophical outlook. Nietzsche's sister heavily edited this book. That's why it's so controversial. However, in recent years, it's become increasingly clear how, when, and what Nietzsche's sister changed about the book, and which parts are authentically by Nietzsche. In other words, we know almost exactly how Nietzsche's sister distorted her brother's ideas. Still, the fact remains that Nietzsche never published these notes. Therefore, it remains an open question of whether or not we can take the ideas presented here as authentically Nietzsche. There's a reason he didn't want to publish them. Perhaps most controversially, in this book, Nietzsche seems to think about the eternal return, an idea that features prominently in The Joyful Science and Thus Spoke Zarathustra, as an actual physical phenomenon, a true state of affairs, rather than it just being a metaphor or a thought experiment as in earlier works. We discussed this issue in more detail in our dedicated video on The Will to Power. This book being a non-canonical work by Nietzsche, I wasn't sure whether or not to include it in the tier list or not. I'm not going to put it in a tier, but I felt like the video would be incomplete if I didn't at least mention this work. So consider this book a bonus if you're a true Nietzsche enthusiast. Just be careful with taking statements and quotes from this book out of context. And there you have it, a tier list of all of Nietzsche's major works. If there is enough interest, we can definitely tackle Nietzsche's more obscure earlier works. And if you're looking to start reading Nietzsche, look no further than our video answering that very question. We have detailed analysis videos on most of his works mentioned here, so feel free to check them out, as they are linked in the description. You can start with our video on the Genealogy of Morals, which is, in my opinion, the best analysis we have here on the channel. A big thank you goes out to our Patreons. They keep the channel going with their generous support. Join their ranks and get access to a dozen exclusive videos and my eternal gratitude. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.